Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. I'm your host Richie Billing, and today I'm delighted to welcome back Abby from the fantastic YouTube channel Political Psych with Abby, as we continue on with our series on creating three-dimensional characters. Last time when Abby joined us, we delved into moral psychology, but I was keen to zoom in even further and discuss the mindsets of the two key characters of our stories, protagonists and antagonists. We look at the likes of self-interest and selflessness, manipulative behaviours, and desires for control. It was an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I'm sure you're going to learn something new, some kind of new angle to help either understand the characters that you created a bit better or to help you create these elusive, lifelike characters that readers love. Before we get started, just a quick reminder that if you enjoy the show, please do show your support by giving us a follow or subscribe. Love us enough to share a quick review or rating on the Spotify mobile app, please do. It's a great way to help other people find us and for us to reach a whole new audience. So if you have left a review or a rating, thank you so much. It is massively appreciated. If you know of anyone who may be interested in the show, please do consider sharing it with them as well. There are lots of share options on all of the podcast platforms. So whatever you're listening on, please consider just a quick share on social media or with your writing group or anyone you know might be interested in the likes of psychology, history, as well as writing. If you would like to continue your learning beyond this podcast, head over to our Patreon page. You can find lots of fantastic resources like blog posts, writing guides, a lot of free content on there as well. You can also access fantasy writing classes. You can also get a copy of a fantasy writer's handbook and also access to exclusive interviews on the likes of world building, which I've done and haven't shared anywhere else but Patreon. As well as this, I've also got a bunch of new resources to share with you. With the links for everything you can find in the description. I've begun a new series on my website, all devoted to world building. So there are 3 new guides that you can find the links to in the description. And I've also recently updated my list of fantasy novel publishers. So if you would like to access a copy of that list, just click the link in the description again. If you'd like more writing advice, resources, or if you'd like to find people to partner up with to do beta reading on your stories or your chapters, then head over to our writing group for more. We meet on Discord and on Facebook, and both are very active places. Lots of wonderful people in there, all very helpful, all keen and enthusiastic to improve. Right, time to get on with the show, and I'm delighted to welcome back Abby from the YouTube channel Political Psych with Abby for a chat about the psychology of villains and heroes. I am delighted to welcome back to the Toolshed someone who's become kind of our resident psychologist, Abby from the fantastic YouTube channel Political Psych with Abby. How are you doing today?
I'm good. And I think I'm legally in some states required to say that I am a political psychologist and not a social psychologist. And I only agree and that I'm not able to offer any sort of psychological or psychiatric advice.
It's fantastic to have you back, Abby. We've had loads of people, emails and messages from Facebook, Instagram and all that, asking for more character creation topics. Some of our chats on psychology have been some of the most popular episodes so far. So big thank you for taking the time to come back to chat with me again today.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to be here.
So previously, we've spoken quite broadly about psychology and how we can apply that to character creation. Last time we spoke more about moral psychology, which was more of like sort of a focus on the mindset of characters. And today I wanted to ask you if we could zoom the lens in even further and ask about villains and heroes and the kind of mindsets that characters like this have, or the kind of traits that they have which lead them down these opposing paths. I think villains for me are always the more interesting because there's something that you're not quite familiar with. It's something a bit unusual, a bit intriguing, and I'm always drawn to villains more than I am heroes. Don't know why. I was just a goth child when I was growing up, always wanting Sauron to win in the end. um, but yeah, I think we were chatting just before we started recording about like the key traits or key characteristics that villains have, which sort of I find them quite interesting because while they are a bit broken, I really like this sort of new era of villains who sort of linger in the grey area between shadow and the light. And so tell us, like, there's a wide variety of heroes, but villains, sorry, but what can you tell us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really important to keep in mind that most people in the real world who do bad things don't necessarily think of themselves as the bad guy, right? I mean, even if they're doing bad things, a lot of people are sort of protected by the way they process their like cognitive dissonance. And what that is the discord, the difference between people's actions and their beliefs, or it can be, I guess, between two different beliefs. But a lot of the time, if someone's actions don't align with their beliefs, you'd like to think, oh, well, they're going to change their actions. But a lot of the time, they'll change the beliefs instead. So people can end up with beliefs that wouldn't make, much sense to a hero, but that make a lot of sense if you're sort of already in that villainous environment. And, people can sort of end up getting, pushed into things, but then really believing in themselves and believing in the cause because that's how the brain is resolving that cognitive dissonance. So that's a big part of it. And then it's also really important to keep in mind that like people do actually, and this is something we were talking about with, the bit on morality, people have different, morals. So you could have, villains who think that they're doing the right thing, who have a very different moral code than the heroes, or one that would be abhorrent to the readers. And then, of course, there are these sort of personality-related political variables. Whether they're personality traits or political traits is a bit controversial within political psychology, but I don't think it matters that much for fantasy writing. Those are social dominance orientation and right-wing authoritarianism. Right-wing authoritarianism, that's basically a view that society should be very orderly, very traditional, everyone and everything in their space, in their own place. That tends to correlate very heavily with conservatism in our own world. But if you go, further into it, it tends to correlate with, fascism and that kind of thing, right? And so that can connect very heavily to totalitarianism and all sorts of, villainous attitudes, villainous actions, that kind of thing. Also, people who would go along with villains or be their sidekicks or that kind of thing would tend to be fairly high in those sorts of traits.
Yeah.
And then we come to social dominance orientation, and that's basically the view that the world should be a strict set of hierarchies. And if your heroes are advocating for a more equal world, then their villains are likely to be pretty high in social dominance orientation.
You never really see many stories where it's the opposite. The hero is the totalitarian.
Although you do have a lot of stories, especially in like medieval fantasy and stuff, where like, the hero is like a king or a prince or something, and like the justness and rightness of like basically the feudal system is not called into question. And that is something that, I'd love to see like more fantasy authors, questioning, because like the other element of my undergrad degree other than psychology was modern history. And so, there's a lot of systems that you see paralleled in fantasy worlds that are not something that it makes a lot of sense to me to glorify. You know what I mean?
Definitely. Especially in the medieval times.
Yeah. And then, another villainous motivation is just the search for power or resources, right? Yeah. And that can be for one's own group or for one as an individual. And that draws from history a lot too, because there's a lot of, competition over resources, that kind of thing. Good old fashioned greed is definitely a thing that exists.
I always think about Hitler. I studied history and we studied Hitler a lot, and a lot of people speculated about his motives and like what was his sort of main driving force. And there were so many motivations behind everything he did. but he's just like, what was the sort of one thing? You're never quite sure whether one thing's like an excuse to do something else, or but yeah,
Yeah.
it's that sort of complexity of character that I think is the real goal when you're writing fictional characters, but it's so hard
Oh,
to do because humans are so complex, as you
yeah.
know all too well.
Yeah. But I find that sometimes people, especially when talking about history, right, they'll focus too much on like the great men of history and not enough on like the circumstances that led to their existence, right?
Yeah,
Like,
definitely. Yeah,
um, like if you're talking about Hitler, there are all these people who are like, oh, it's a cliche example for time travel, right? Of if you go back in time and you shoot Hitler, you do prevent World War II, right? And there's some chance that you don't, right? Because there are all these historical forces and that sort of thing. And that sort of thing I think is really important to keep in mind, that like, historically villains don't really arise and attain power without forces around them, shaping shaping the nature of their movement, that kind of thing, right? So they're not
yeah,
sort of organically existing, right? You need to think about, why they would have supporters, that kind of thing. I mean, assuming that they're not operating completely alone,
yeah,
it is, I guess, probably more common for villains to operate completely alone in fantasy stories than they would be able to in in the real world, right? Because in the real world, you got someone really villainous and they have an army. You have to have reasons of why people would be, coerced or willing to join that army. But in the fantasy world, you could have them be magic zombies or something.
yeah, yeah. You make a really good point there, though, that it's when you're creating your villains to have an understanding of the circumstances in which they're entering this world or which they've been raised or brought up. I think that's a really important thing because, like we said, and when we're creating characters, we think of three dimensions: the physiology, the sociology, which we've covered quite a bit on the podcast as well, and the product of them two is the psychology. And
Yeah.
um, it's really important to be mindful of the sort of the society that they're entering into or what happens in their life. It might sort of go from very idyllic to a complete breakdown of all sorts of morals and becomes quite lawless.
Yeah.
There's loads of different variables, but it's being aware of that sort of journey the character's gone on or will
Yeah.
go on in their life. I think that's hugely important.
Yeah. I think it's also really important to realize, though, that like villains aren't always the product of trauma, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Um, that if someone comes from like a lot of privilege, that can actually interfere with their abilities to be empathetic.
yeah,
Um, and coming from a lot doesn't mean that you're not going to continue to be greedy or selfish or that kind of thing, or even just to continue to say, if we're having, let's go with the fantasy villain of an evil lord. Maybe his dad was the evil lord and he just wants to continue that, right? So you can have someone who's doing these incredibly villainous things who doesn't really have like a super dark backstory from their own perspective, right?
yeah. No, that's dead on. Yeah. Something I was going to ask you about as well, with like the different sorts of I suppose you can look at there's like a spectrum of villainy, isn't there, where you've got on one end just the pure evil bastards that they don't really need much of a justification for what to do, and they just who they are.
Yeah.
And then on the other end, there's probably the people who like Heisenberg, I suppose. If you've seen Breaking Bad, I always think he's a great example of someone who's bad, but at the same time, he's not quite as evil as everybody else in that fucking show.
Oh, yeah, coming from.
But yeah, and so I always wonder about like why or how these characters, when we get into their heads, how they live with themselves on a day-to-day basis. Because when we're writing from their perspective, we've got to know and understand what it's like to be in their shoes and how they live with the things that they do. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, the cognitive dissonance thing I was talking about before, I think is really key to understanding that a lot of the time, if people's actions and their views don't align, they'll change their views, right? So they feel like they're morally in the right, that kind of thing. And then, of course, there are characters who start off thinking that they're in the right. But I think that the more the character is sort of, different from the other villains around them, or the more recently they've entered the sort of villainous world, the more conflicted they might be. It's sort of the brain adapting to make us not perpetually uncomfortable is the resolving of cognitive dissonance. And also it's super important to realize that a lot of the way we operate in the world is influenced by sort of the norms of our society and our culture. And that can be a microculture too. That can be something, really small around us, right? So if you have a character who's sort of, newly villainous and they're spending all their time with other villainous characters, the way that they sort of start to believe that it's normal to operate in society will change, right?
Yeah.
And they'll start to feel like, something that they might have previously thought was completely abhorrent, they'll start to think of that as normal.
And what kind of, is there a sort of process that people follow when they go through this change? Or, I can imagine it's more, it depends, obviously depends on the person, but I can imagine it to be more gradual rather than...
I would imagine that it's fairly gradual, but it's not necessarily something that I've seen like that much discussed as a process, because the main things that I've seen like with social norms are like, because the way you study them in psychology is typically by artificially altering what people think a norm is and then watching their views change along with it. And that's like fairly sudden. Yeah. But I would imagine that in reality, they change more slowly. But that's hard to measure under laboratory conditions, if you get what I mean.
Yeah. It's very much like an internal battle, isn't it, between what you believe.
But a lot of the time people don't even realize that battle is going on, because there's actually some people within psychology that basically theorize that your opinion isn't really formed until you start thinking about it or until you're asked to think about it. So like if I was going to ask you your view on a particular issue, there's some chance that you're forming that view as you're giving me your answer.
Interesting idea. Yeah.
We don't necessarily think about every choice we're going to have in life or every view we're going to have before we're presented in a situation where we have to do that as like a snap judgment, right?
Yeah. What do you think about a sort of lack of fear of repercussions for your actions? Like you feel completely free and unhindered to do whatever you want. Like it's sort of like a godlike complex, is it?
No, yeah, I get where you're coming from. So like different people definitely display sort of different amounts of fear, right? That's absolutely a thing. What's really interesting is that a lot of the time, what translates into aggression isn't necessarily fearlessness, it's fear. So it's quite common for like people in the US, for example, who keep a lot of guns around and sort of fantasize about using them on other people, tend to believe the world is a very dangerous and scary place, right?
Yeah, I imagine.
So, I mean, that sort of feeling of invulnerability, that does happen with privilege to some extent. And that definitely impedes someone's sort of ability to make judgments. Yeah, the sort of like action hero type isn't really something that gets studied in political psychology very much. There's a lot of people who will sort of take more aggressive actions because they believe the world is dangerous. But you do have some people who are just sort of thinking, I mean, people do tend to underestimate bad things regarding themselves a lot of the time. Like people are really bad at judging odds, and those odds judgments are super biased by emotion, and they are biased different people. I hope that helps.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I think you've covered some great points. And something I wanted to ask you as well. One thing that a lot of villains are good at, manipulating other people.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the way that people will gather a following is sort of similar, whether they're doing it for good or for bad, right? So a lot of that is around relating yourself to an already existing identity of a group or forming that identity around you, right? So if you are, let's say you're trying to unite a group of people from a village to go do something that you want done, you're going to want to make it seem like you're one of them, or like you are the way they want to be. You're a positive representation of their identity, that kind of thing. And that you align with their specific ideals. And that's going to be true whether it's someone who's heroic, who's in a leadership position, or someone who's villainous. A lot of the time, with, people who do bad things, it does involve sort of warping people's perception of what their self-interest is or what the interests of their community are, right? So, encouraging oppressed communities to see each other as competition rather than allies. That's something a villainous character would do. Or, encouraging people to, blame a group who it's not really their fault for their struggles, right? Scapegoating is quite effective. And also like framing problems a particular way. So issue framing, like, let's say, in your fantasy world, there's a group of people who are going hungry, right? The villain, if you're talking, your hero, the hero could be like, we're going particularly radical. Let's go get all your grain stores back from the Lord who's hoarding them. Where a villain might be like, the problem is that this woman who lives on the edge of your village has put a spell on everything. And that, that woman actually hasn't, and then gets the villagers to go, kill her or something. And whole groups can be scapegoated like that. And that's definitely something that villains do a lot. They'll try and redirect people's anger when the anger might be justified towards sort of the wrong group, the wrong source, in a way that isn't really going to help those people, but will make them feel like they're doing something about how their lives are.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting to look at like cult leaders as well, and how they seduce people into doing anything that comes to mind they will do, that kind of gurus in India as well. There's some really cool documentaries about like how people just like left everything to go and follow them, and like that sort of connecting with people on that level.
Yeah, I mean,
fascinating. Like, I don't know.
It is super interesting.
Yeah, like to sort of have that sway over them. But that's what a lot of villains possess, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think part of that is like charisma, and that's hard to measure. But part of that is also like, I think, if you encourage people to sink a lot of things into something like a cult or a villainous cause, they're more likely to stick with it, right? Especially if their identity gets tied up in it, especially if their social network is there. So like your villainous character is probably going to be encouraging their minions to cut ties with people outside the villainous organization, right? Unless those ties are useful for something.
So I wanted to ask you as well about the sort of more grey villains, the ones who maybe they're where they shouldn't quite be. They've been led astray, or there's some kind of situation has pushed them to the darker side of life. What can you tell us about these kind of characters?
Well, I feel like a lot of the time that might be a product of, them pursuing their own self-interest, at least starting out, or possibly sort of having fallen in with a bad crowd. That does happen to people, a lot in reality. They'll find community in a community that is toxic or has bad goals or that kind of thing. And then you can also come to characters that have, a different moral and ethical code than the characters, but still have a code, right? So that can be an interesting thing, especially if they still have, some sort of sense of honor.
Yeah. I always think, I don't know if you've ever seen The Wire. Omar Little.
No, I actually haven't seen The Wire. I swear I've seen things. I keep not having seen the things you're mentioning.
Yeah. Well, if anyone out there listening, if you've never seen The Wire and you want to learn about how to create characters, every character in that show is phenomenal. And there's so much life behind what you see on the screen. It's insane. But one of the characters, Omar Little, he robs drug dealers. So he goes around killing people. He's a bit of a Robin Hood figure. So whatever he makes, he gives back.
Yeah.
So he's a really interesting character, and that sort of contradiction that he's still going around killing people, but at the same time he's
yeah. And actually, you mentioning the why reminded me, I think it's also really important to keep in mind that, in reality, a lot of the time, people are made to do things like crime, especially, lower level crime, because they're sort of forced into it by circumstance, or they don't have a lot of other options.
Yeah.
So, I think that carries over into the fantasy world too, assuming things like poverty exist in your fantasy world.
Yeah, I think, I was thinking about this the other day. I don't really think that stories like this about the impoverished people or the people at the bottom, and while there's always the sort of the orphan kid who has got magical powers and rises up from nothing to become biggest, best wizard in the world.
Yeah.
I love the stories about the ordinary folk and these tales of struggles and stuff like that. Like people living in poverty have to face every day, and that's what I'd love to see more of in fantasy. And
Yeah, no, it would be a great thing to see more of in fantasy. I think a lot of the time, fantasy can be sort of old fashioned in the way that it really focuses on the elite, or that, people will become, aristocrats or whatever by the end of the story.
yeah, that's the end game, eh?
Yeah.
Being a lord and getting a
I
castle.
mean, it's the only way to have happily ever after in a feudalist system, just about, right?
I know, I know. So you mentioned there about self-interest being one of the main driving forces for a lot of these sort of grey villains. So can you tell us a bit more about self-interest and how powerful a motivation that is for people?
Yeah. So, there's some dispute about how powerful a motivation it is when it comes to like political decision making. But most political decision making is very different than like the decision about whether or not to, like, I don't know, rob someone or something like that, because it tends to have sort of smaller personal consequences, right? But if you do phrase an issue more personally, people do tend to be a bit more self-interested and relate things more to their own circumstances. Um, Self-interest is actually kind of a hard thing to define. And it's also important to realize that like people may not be able to perfectly figure out what their self-interest even is, because they could have limited information, all that kind of thing. But also, like, how are we thinking about, collective interest, and what's the collective there, right? So like there is some dispute about whether self-interest should also include the interest of your community and that kind of thing, right? Because that can also be a really big motivator, or, the interests of other people you care about, right? So you could even have like a villainous character who, has somewhat altruistic motives, like, they have a particular family member they care about, right? And that can motivate their villainy in some ways, right?
Yeah.
And then also, like, you do come to the question of like whether two people in identical material circumstances are going to have the same self-interest, right? How you factor in their morality and that kind of thing, and variance and preferences that they have. But that'll lead you off track from fantasy writing pretty fast there if you keep going a philosophical route there, I imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting because I wanted to sort of segue into the other side of the coin and the good guys and the motivations and the mindsets that they have. And you mentioned their collective interest, and I think what you said about like villains can have collective interest as well, and it might be for a few individuals or it could be for an entire country. It just shows you how blurred the line can be.
I think that collective interest thing is a really big thing in heroic motivations, but someone can also be, self-interested in a way that's heroic if, things line up a particular way. Sometimes, in your very simple, fantasy story where, the villain kills the hero's family or something, the hero can start off just trying to save their own skin, right? Or they maybe have like a different motivation, like they want to be a powerful wizard or something, so they don't have to start out with a heroic motivation in order to be the hero. But I think that what makes them heroic a lot of the time is sort of the selflessness, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think you have to think about your hero's values and that kind of thing. That is, important.
And would these be values then that things that make people likable? Like you say, being selfless and
yeah. No, I guess I was thinking more about like their moral code and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But like things like selflessness and caring for others and stuff does make someone likable, right? But you can, I guess, you can have a hero who's not like a super likable person on an interpersonal level, right?
Yeah.
But I think that, there are reasons not to do that, right? Because if someone's a good person, they are probably going to make an effort to be nice to the people around them. Thinking that the people around you are kind of scum is one of the ways to end up being vaguely villainous, right? So, like, you could definitely have a hero who's like socially inept, but if they just sort of hate everyone, they're probably not going to be that heroic.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I've read so many stories where there's like, some guy who's like real gruff and everything, doesn't get along with everyone, and this is supposed to be the hero you're supposed to look up to, especially in like stories that are like really, really oriented around like men and masculinity. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like the idea that like niceness is weakness. I'm like, that's just not true.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. But I think it still exists, especially in the mindset of a lot of men. And that's, as it's sort of starting to melt away and erode, it's interesting to see the hangover and the contrast between this sort of newer, more accepting attitude from like the younger generations, and then the hardline approach from the. I suppose it's always been like that though. Maybe it is just as you get old, you become more of an ass.
Yeah, I guess maybe, I don't know, but I sort of think that I find a lot of the time that in reality, people who are kind of an ass also don't tend to have like a great moral code after all. And so I have difficulty conceptualizing of a real person who's intentionally a bit of an ass and also heroic. You know what I mean?
Yeah, most definitely. Well, Avi, it's been fantastic chatting with you again today. I've learned so much about villains, and I hope you out there have learned something too. Avi, can you tell us a bit about how we can find out a bit more about your YouTube channel and the kind of stuff that you like the content that you like to create?
Yeah, sure. So I think there'll be a link in the description. Yeah.
Yeah, everything will be in the description.
Yeah, great. If for some reason you can't find that, if you put in Political Psych with Abby into YouTube, you'll probably find me. The channel is called Political Psych with Abby. Hopefully there'll be new content by the time this comes out, but I don't know. The videos take a while. There's a lot of research and stuff involved. But I generally try and have one out like every 2 months.
Yeah, excellent though. So please do go and check them out.
Yep. And I've also got Instagram and Reddit, and I'm thinking you can either get to those from my channel or maybe they'll be linked in the description.
Yeah, I'll link everything in the description. Fantastic.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Avi.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I forgot one thing. Oh, yeah. And if you want to like help me buy books for research and stuff, and also just generally support the channel, if you really like what I do, I also have a Patreon.
Nice. Yes, go and check that out, everyone. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Avi. It's been fantastic chatting with you again. I hope you out there have learned something new. And yeah, we'll speak to you next time. A big thank you to Abby for taking the time to chat with me about our villainous characters and our heroes and the kind of psychological mindsets or traits that they have. Hopefully that's given you some insight into your own characters and given you some ideas to help better get into their heads. You never know, it might make the characters that you've created so far more compelling, or it might just help down the line when it comes to writing that next story, that next book. Something that you've listened to here today might be in your mind, and it might just pop up there when you need it most. If you have enjoyed today's show, please do consider following or subscribing. If you've got a few seconds to spare, a review or a quick rating on Spotify would be absolutely wonderful. Please also share the show with anyone you think may be interested. And if you would like to learn more, either through fantasy writing classes, blog posts and guides, or books on writing fantasy, head over to our Patreon page. And don't forget to check out our new world-building resources, as well as a list of fantasy novel publishers. The links for all of them you can find in the description. Thank you very much for listening today. We'll be back on the 14th of August for an episode that I'm very excited to share with you. It's all about the Knights of the Middle Ages, and we look basically from when knights first came around to where they ended up, and the whole idea of chivalry. And again, it ties into the psychology of characters as well, because knights were very, very powerful figures in society, and this code of chivalry was intended to keep them in check. But as we'll see when Aidan Matters joins us again, it didn't all work out like that. We've also been welcoming back sociologist Enn Burke to the Toolshed later in August for a chat again about the evil and villainous characters that are so popular in our stories. So do follow, subscribe to make sure you don't miss them. Thank you very much for listening today, and keep on scribbling.